Chapter 9 Memories of a Past Life. The Vestige plane was strange now that he was older. Vestige plane was the name he had given to differentiate it, but it didn't feel quite right. Sure, this is where the people in his head stayed, but he didn't know what they were vestiges of. The name just felt correct. It hadn't changed much since he had gotten older. He had his carpet that he stayed on beside the table. He had a chair with the rest, but it just wasn't as comfy. He much preferred the soft all-night carpet he had. He had even found a little bookshelf that seemed to always have a fresh notebook just when he needed it. It was easy here. The adults tended to zone out and go wherever they went. He could enjoy the quiet and peace while still taking notes on his life. The one thing he couldn't figure out, the glowing yellow figure. No one would tell him who it was. The form constantly shifted between multiple images, and even looking at it gave him a headache. He tried touching it once as an experiment, but it had resisted, and he had somehow ended it back up on his carpet. Nana dropped his gaze whenever he asked. Yoichi stared at him knowingly. It was torture at first, though easy enough to ignore after a bit. He'd figure it out when he got into UA. That was the point of all this, to figure out that this was his quirk, and not just DID. He knew it wasn't just DID. They had told him it, but it didn't quite fit with anything he had read or seen. His mom had gotten him into a support group for the first year after Miss Chio had told him he had DID, but he didn't have any of the same things as everyone else did. It was a small group of like 5 people who were all older than him. It was so different and hard to relate. He didn't lose time. He didn't struggle when he put himself out. He could control his switches. It had to be his quirk. There was no other option. So he had to get into UA. They would show him how to use his quirk to be a hero. Even if he had to fight quirkless, he would be a hero and he would get into UA. His group of old heroes agreed that it was the best choice as well. Izuku, Nana asked, touching his shoulder slightly. He jumped, looking over at her with a grin. What's up? He asked, setting down the notebook he had on his lap. You were mumbling again, she said with a shrug. She sat beside him on the carpet, yawning. You gonna go out there? She asked, gesturing to the view. He'd kinda ignored the conversation Kachan had with Dai, letting them just talk. Kachan needed more friends anyway. Don't know, Izuku finally said, shrugging. If it's loud, probably not. I just don't want to deal with people. Nana nodded in understanding. None of us have the same knowledge you do, she said. You should probably take whatever written tests they have. He bit his cheek before nodding. I'm worried I can't really do it without my notes. You got it, Izuku, she said, grinning at him. You're a smart kid. I'm proud of you. She gave him a small side hug as he giggled, nodding. You should do the physical test, he said, looking up at her. She shook her head quickly, rubbing at her neck. No, I think my fighting style is a bit... She paused, trying to think of a word. Strange, she finally went with. He shrugged, looking between the others. Yes, he could control when he switched. Sort of. It was more a mess of emotions, or when he could tell the person fronting was getting tired, and he couldn't truly choose who went out. The only one he could confidently switch out was himself. The others were somewhat random, whatever his subconscious wanted at the moment. He turned his attention back to the outside view, Dai splitting from Kachan. That wasn't right. They were supposed to sit beside each other so Izuku could switch out. Dai needed to warn Kachan so he could switch, but Izuku had no way to tell Dai that. He stood up right as Dai sat down, walking to the front. What are you planning? Yoichi asked from his chair, his gaze locked on Izuku. He was the first. Izuku could tell he was the oldest, even if he looked younger than the others. He had control over this place, more than anyone else. He had shown Izuku a trick, but it was still in work. He didn't try it often. He was waiting for UA to help him. He ignored Yoichi's question, touching the invisible wall. He didn't feel any different, but Nana shouted out a warning, the others all adjusting. He turned his hand slowly, trying to feel for it. He needed to feel a change, but he couldn't. Izuku, cut that shit out, N yelled, but he ignored him, pushing harder. He needed to force the switch now. Dai didn't know quirk theory like he did. Silence. Quiet. Izuku gasped, coughing loudly as he fell out of the chair, his throat closing up on him. He couldn't feel his body or his hands as he stumbled again, laying on the floor. It hit him at once, his stomach churning and his breakfast threatening to come up. He swallowed it down, slamming his eyes shut as the lights were too loud. The noises assaulted him, everything too heavy and strong. Something grabbed his arm and he tried to push it away, his head pounding. Are you all right? A deep voice asked, the pressure staying still. Izuku tried to respond, but his tongue was heavy in his mouth and he couldn't get any words out. An explosion came from beside him, and he winced as people screamed in shock. Fucking hell, Zuku! Kachan screamed before he paused slightly. You forced it too fast, he inferred, speaking quieter. Bakugou from Aldera. You are Midoriya's classmate, aren't you? The deep voice asked. Izuku knew it. He knew it. He just had to remember the name. Kachan's warm hands touched his arm as he grunted out a response. Yeah, I'm with the nerd. I told them not to separate us, he said sternly, helping Izuku sit up. You good to open your eyes? Kachan asked. It's bright as shit in here. Izuku bit his cheek and nodded, his feeling returning faster. He cracked open an eye, the light making him wince as he forced his other open. Kachan knelt in front of him, nodding slowly. A larger man stood beside him, looking down. Ectoplasm, he whispered, his tongue loosening. Oh my god, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. Kachan's hand tightened on his arm as she shook his head. No mumbling, nerd. Let's get you back in your seat. He didn't ask who had switched out, helping Izuku stand on shaky legs. He could feel everyone's gaze on him, the room dead silent. Are you all right? Ectoplasm asked as Kachan helped him sit. The world spun as he swallowed and nodded slightly. Is there a quirk issue we did not adjust for? He asked kindly. Izuku bit his lip, looking at Kachan. He sighed, shaking his head. Nah, it's a medical thing. He has DID. The change in location just gave him a much more violent shift. He paused, crossing his arms as he glared up at the hero. Which is why I told your dumbass copy that we needed to sit together. Ectoplasm didn't flinch at the curse, luckily, nodding slightly. We do not permit it, due to cheating concerns. He paused, looking down at Izuku, who quickly avoided his gaze. Though, I suppose we can make an exception. We were meant to be aware of any concerns ahead of time. Kachan shrugged, watching as Izuku switched out his band to give himself something to do. Not my fault your forms didn't have anything for this. It ain't a quirk issue, he reiterated. Ectoplasm nodded, looking down the road. Kirishima, I will have you switch places with Bakugou, he said calmly. The black-haired boy beside him nodded, looking at Izuku. He ducked his head as the boy shifted out beside him. Real manly, dude, he whispered quietly to Kachan, who raised an eyebrow. Sit, Ectoplasm said, placing two upside-down packets in front of them. It is time to get started. Izuku didn't struggle with many of the homework questions. He had taken ample notes on it while someone else was fronting, trying to memorize everything. The questions on reading and English he got quickly. He struggled with the older maths, but he managed to get them all they had learned in school. The bonus high school questions he tried on, but he wasn't confident in them. Even the quirk law questions he managed to score high on, taking notes as they tutored Kachan at the library. He was going to make it. There was no way he won it. The quirk theory questions were his favorite. They always had been. To be able to ramble about how not one quirk is superior to another, the way to apply a quirk such as magnetism, or how to advance in quirk sciences, the theory on what it meant to be a hero. He had heard them talking before, had spoken to them before. He had no doubt that they truly were heroes at one point. Yoichi was the one who was strongest. Kudo was the one who knew strategy. Bruce was smart. Hikage analyzed. Dai was kind. En was stubborn, and Nana was selfless. They were all heroes, but not one had every trait of a hero. It was impossible to have all traits. There wasn't a single true hero path one could take. Even All Might wasn't perfect, no matter how much he wanted to believe he was. There was always a side of heroes cameras didn't show. And to be perfect would be to have flaws, but to not let those flaws get in your way. Be too kind and you're gullible. Too selfless and you self-destruct. Too smart and you miss simple things. Each coin had two sides. A quirk doesn't make a hero, just like a quirk doesn't make a villain. Kachan was proof of that. A powerful, destructive quirk, and he was the most heroic person Izuku knew. The bell rang and he jumped, looking around frantically. Kachan flipped his paper over and Izuku did the same, taking a deep breath. Are you feeling all right? Kachan asked, elbowing him gently. He nodded, feeling slightly more sure of himself. I think he started before the room erupted in noise. He slammed his hands over his ears, biting his lip. He didn't like loud sounds. He had never gotten used to them. He didn't like them even as a child. But he couldn't force a switch. Not now. He had to talk to Kachan. He had to figure out how the physical portion was going to work. Kacchan gave him a pitying look, tapping him gently on the arm. Izuku shook his head, shutting his eyes as his head ached. He couldn't switch out now. Someone grabbed the paper from him in front of him, but he didn't react, the pounding sound growing louder and louder. Silence. Darkness. Kudo didn't move, keeping his head resting on the table. The pins and needles that came from his body and the pounding headache did little to help in the switch. What did help was the fact he had a backpack under his forehead, so he wasn't lying directly on the table. He tuned out the chatter, focusing instead on his body. Without body awareness, he couldn't do anything. He slowly moved his toes, the motion sending phantom pains up his legs as he flexed each muscle in turn, running up his body. By the time he reached his neck, he sat up slowly, rubbing at air. Been a bit since you've popped out, Kudo, Bakugou said, taking the backpack and hanging it on the back of his chair. Zuku all right? We are in public, he reminded the boy as the teacher's clones collected the pages. You know the name. I expect you to use it, he reminded the boy. Bakugou shrugged, sitting back. K2. He drugged the name out, looking over at him. Is Izuku okay? Kudo nodded. He is. You know as well as I do that he isn't used to loud noise. I don't know what his plan is for when he gets in. Kudo sighed, rubbing his eyes. A hero can be uncomfortable in loud situations, especially if he leaves it all to us. Bakugou shrugged, looking around the noisy place. Children were filled in every seat, their own conversations covering up his. They were around the same age his daughter had been, and he couldn't help but look away as a brunette matched his eyes. She looked so familiar to her. You crying, old man? Bakugou asked, his voice pitched in surprise. Kudo went to respond before a loud scream tore through the room. Who's ready for the test of a lifetime? The voice screeched, a very bright hero running into the room. That was one thing that had changed from his time. The so-called heroes, protectors, were gaudy, with flashy colors and a bold costume. That was what got you killed on the field. Standing out was never a good thing. Oh, God, Kudo mumbled, rubbing at his eyes at the dead silence that filled the room. Are we ready to rumble? The hero screamed again, clapping his hands together. Can I hear a yeah? His voice somehow went another octave louder. Kudo shut his eyes, ignoring the loud hero and kids. If Izuku didn't switch him out before the physical fight, that meant he'd have to deal with whatever nonsense the hero jokes came up with. Hopefully he could manage to snag a gun, but that would be very small likelihood. Bakugou elbowed him and he jumped, yawning slightly. If this is an error, it is a horrible part on Yue's case, a kid yelled, his hands swinging wildly. Kudo raised an eyebrow at the interruption, the kid adjusting his glasses. I'm glad you mentioned that, dear listener, the hero called, no longer screaming. The 0 pointers are just an obstacle. You won't receive any points, so I suggest you just leave them be. Kudo shut his eyes again, stifling a yawn. And you, the boy called again. Bakugou elbowed him roughly, and he groaned, opening his eyes again. Coming in here and starting such a scene before the test, and now you try to sleep? If you don't take this seriously, why did you even show up? He shouted accusingly, pointing at Kudo. Bakugou went to defend him, but Kudo put his hand on his shoulder. He could hear the hero trying to shush him, but he ignored the extra noise. I have a medical condition, he said seriously, standing up slowly. Unfortunately, I do not have the same privileges you do, and I was having a medical concern, Kudo said roughly, glaring at the boy. If you cannot respect people's privacy not to pry into their medical lives from a single incident, I don't think you belong at a hero school. The boy stuttered slightly, his hand pausing in the busy room. Everyone went dead silent, waiting for a response. When one didn't come, Kudo sat down again, looking at the hero. Yes, he said, clearing his throat. Please refrain from starting arguments in class. The hero nodded and turned back to the board. He moved the conversation back to the fight as the blue-haired boy sat down quickly. You're making friends already, Bakugou laughed, shaking his head. Kudo grinned, flipping him off as he watched the hero continue uninterrupted on his tangent. The kid could make friends. He was just supposed to make sure the kid didn't get himself killed or exposed. And if he did, he had to deal with the aftermath. He wouldn't let Yoichi deal with any more stress. Neither any of his successors. He was the one who always was the head of the revolution and of the Vestiges. He would ensure they stayed safe. Luckily for him, Bakugou was separated to a different battlefield. They had to reassure the heroes that it would be okay, and even then they were hesitant. But after a bit of convincing that they wouldn't switch out in the battle, he was finally allowed to be by himself. It meant he didn't have to watch out for the headstrong kid and keep him safe. Unluckily, however, the blue-haired boy was assigned to his field. He could just ignore the boy, but judging by the kid's stare, it might be difficult. Kudo sidestepped around another person, inching his way to the front of the crowd. Despite all the time they had spent training, the kid was still smaller. So he was easily able to stand in front of the crowd, adjusting his feet to prepare for the onslaught. "Go!" the hero shouted, his quirk activating. Kudo was off, directed for one of the small alleyways in the fake city. It was an insane waste of resources and money, but he ignored it, searching the first building he stumbled across. He could hear quirks activating, but he ignored them, throwing open drawers and cabinets. He eventually found what he was looking for, a small knife, tucked into the back of a drawer. For all purposes, it would make sense to hide small weapons around. Not all children had a fighting quirk. His next issue was finding something else. He located a stick long enough for what he needed as someone tore up a robot and left it staggering. He ripped the metal piece off, attaching the knife to the end. It was crude and far worse than anything he had once used, but it would work. He adjusted his hold on it and to prepare to run out when someone ran directly into him. He grabbed them before they fell, twisting so he had a better grip on the wrist. "Are you okay?" he asked quickly, righting them. It was the brunette from the classroom, the one who looked so much like her, a face he would have never thought he'd see again. "Yeah, I'm all right," she laughed nervously, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Thank you," she said hurriedly before rushing off. He stared after her, losing his train of thought as she got further away. He wouldn't lose her again. A hand grabbed his own as he went to follow her, the blue-haired boy stopping him. "I hope you don't plan to drag her down with you," he said harshly, letting go of his wrist. Kudo shook his head, trying to get his thoughts on straight. "I won't," he said roughly. "Focus on yourself," he reminded the boy, before walking around him and running the other way. The small robots were for the most part already taken down. The ones he managed to find went down once he managed to hit exposed wires as they moved. For such an elaborate fake city, the robots were clearly made not to injure. When the mark hit that the hero yelled out again, he was far behind. The ground rumbled and he gritted his teeth, bracing himself with the makeshift staff. The building nearest to him crashed while the kids flooded out screaming. He groaned as a large robot rolled through, larger than any of the others. It had to be worth more points than the rest. He was regretting not paying more attention. As students raced past him, he ran at the behemoth, his staff tucked to his side. It would be easy enough to use his staff as a handhold to get onto the thing's back from its tread wheels. Its big size meant it wouldn't be able to knock him off easily, even if it noticed him. He was a foot away, preparing to strike his staff into the tread, when someone screamed nearby. He shot his gaze to theirs, the girl from before, the one who looked so much like her. He had let her go once. He had watched her die once. He wouldn't again. He clutched the staff tighter, running to the girl's side as the robot drew nearer. "What's hurting? Is anything pinned?" he asked quickly, crouching beside her. She nodded, her face twisted in pain. Blood came from a cut on her forehead, and traces of vomit ran down her chin. "My leg, I can't feel it," she whispered, whimpering. He nodded, moving down to her leg. It was trapped under some rubble, though her leg had mostly fallen in a cradle below it. "This is going to hurt," he whispered, pulling the knife off the metal piece. "Bite down on your shirt. Don't bite your cheek," he told her quickly. She nodded, lifting her shirt slowly and biting down on the collar. It wasn't ideal to protect her tongue, but he wasn't going to ask her to strip. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. "Breathe," he said, before grabbing the bottom of the stone. He popped the metal under it and shoved with all the new muscle they had built up. The girl's scream tore at his heart as he managed to get the boulder up, the metal holding it. He ran to her front and took her by the shoulders, pulling her out. The boulder fell the next second as he picked her up, slinging her arm over his shoulder. "This is still going to hurt," he whispered. She nodded, tightening her grip on his neck as he turned and ran. The robot was getting closer, far closer than was safe. This was idiocy. He kept running, his lungs starting to burn with the added weight. She didn't say anything, allowing him to focus on getting away. He ducked down an alley the second the robot came rolling down. He bit his lip, tucking them further into the messy alley as it continued down. The seconds were ticking away, and he needed to get out. But he needed to make sure she was okay. He wouldn't let her get hurt, even if it wasn't really her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, setting her down on a box. He could hear the people continue to scream, but he ignored them, focused on her. The test must be nearing the end. She nodded, still biting her shirt. She pulled it out of her mouth, tears running down her face. It hurts, she whispered, nodding. I need to get more points. She went to stand up, but he didn't let her, keeping her seated. It's okay. I'm sure you've gotten plenty. Right now you need to rest, and we can't upset your leg more. She shut her eyes, nodding as she barely adjusted her leg and flinched in pain. He grabbed a piece of wood, ripping the bottom of the kid's corny shirt. What are you doing? She asked, stopping him. He heard the alarm sound, marking the end of the test, but ignored it, finishing ripping the bottom of the shirt. We need to splint it, until they can get here, he explained. He set it against her leg, slowly moving his hand down her leg. It isn't a break, he confirmed. It's still good to support it. He set it against her calf, wrapping it with his shirt. It was messy and worse work than he had ever done, but it would do the trick. He would have gotten on any of his people's case if they tried to support like this on the field. How do you know what you're doing? She asked, wiping her eyes. He hummed, looking into her eyes. They really look so much like hers. It was almost uncanny. I've splinted a lot of bones, he said without thinking. He wiped at a tear as it rolled down her cheek, trying to give her a comforting smile. Her eyebrows twisted in confusion, and she opened her mouth to speak again. Someone cleared their throat behind him, and he spun around, grabbing the knife he had tucked into his belt. Mind if I take care of it, Izuku dearie? The small woman asked, barely regarding the knife. He nodded, stepping aside as it slid back into the belt. Who are you? He asked hesitantly, looking between the woman and the girl. She looked familiar, but right now his focus was on the girl only. The others could figure it out. She laughed slightly, bending to the splint. I am Recovery Girl, the school's nurse. She hummed slightly, clicking her tongue. This is an impressive job for a kid. For now, we can leave it. I don't want to exhaust you too much by using my quirks, sweetie. The girl nodded, wiping at her eyes again. I think I threw up all my breakfast. She chuckled slightly. The nurse laughed, looking back at Kudo. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of speaking to you. However, introductions will have to wait. Would you mind taking her down to my office? Just follow the bots. Oh crap. Right. He was supposed to know her. She was Izuku's doctor. But the school nurse. He'd have to talk to the others while Izuku was fronting. If she was here, she may be reporting to 8. They couldn't risk anything endangering the kid. Izuku, was it? The girl asked, waving a hand in front of his face. He nodded. He jumped, nodding quickly. Let's get you to the nurse's office, he said quickly, shaking his head. The girl smiled and nodded, his heart breaking as he looked away from her. He had managed to save her this time. The girl didn't speak as he led her along, which he was grateful for. If she was under the impression Izuku was fronting now, he didn't want to ruin anything between them, and he needed to worry about other things now that the awful test was over, like texting Bakugou and letting him know he would be just a bit late. Okay, so, just some notes. These ones are specifically from the chapter. For Kudo's backstory, every time he saw Ochako, he was actually reminded of his daughter, which was said a few times, but I was trying to make sure it was, clearer of what he was talking about when he was saying Ochako looked like her. It's his daughter. I believe in the days of when quirks were first coming out, in that entire revolution thing, that Kudo lost his daughter. And I actually have a separate story that I may podfic eventually, called The Heroes of Our Past or something, and it actually has more in detailed stories that I think of each vestige. So, Kudo, he joined the revolution because he actually lost his daughter, and, Bruce, the third, lost his fiancée. So, that's kind of that. It's not really important to this story, it was just made to, set up that character, and to introduce Ochako's first impressions of him, because keep in mind, she thinks it's Izuku, she doesn't understand that he has DID, you know. Okay, let's see. This one, the entire first part, I wanted to show how Izuku, thinks of the Vestige plane now that he's older. The fact that, he knows it's his quirk, but he's pretty clueless about it, because the others have really kept him in the dark. Yeah, he will eventually talk to All Might, but not now. Let's see, what else was there in this one? Oh, again, you heard that little noise. I am so sorry. That was actually
Reddit, of course, because why not? Oh, someone subscribed to my channel. Anyways, that was Reddit because, yeah. I think that's actually it. Thank you guys so much for listening. The next one is called Acceptances, and we will see you there.